Shalom, shalom. I'm back. So, um, we're going to focus on today part two, or really how not to be a concubine. Okay, I'm sure some of you all have been waiting for this moment. I know I've been getting some eager requests like, "Oh, when's it gonna come out?" Anyway, let's go ahead and pray. Abba Yahuwah, Toda Rabbah for this day that you've given us. Abba, I pray in Yahushua's name that you would be with us in this message, that your presence, that your anointing, that your power would be with my tongue, that would speak forth in my mind, that would speak forth your word in truth and in love and in shalom and in everything that is good and righteousness and holiness. Abba, be glorified in this message. May your people be edified to learn and to know what you desire for your people, what you desire for your sons and for your daughters, to return us back to the ancient path of kingdom marriages, so that your kingdom come, your will be done on this earth as it is in Hashemayim. That literally, by doing so, by learning your ways, that we can literally be a part of bringing heaven on earth. Hallelujah. Toda Rabbah. Help us to walk faithfully, joyfully, and lovingly before you in all humility. B'Shem Yehushua HaMashiach HaNazari. Amen. Okay, so we're going to focus on how not to be a concubine. So we're going to focus on the first thing, the word concubine. Where does the word concubine come from? Okay, if you look up the word concubine in the Strong's, it is Strong's number, okay, my little notes here. It is Strong's number 6370, and the word is pilegesh. Pilegesh. Okay, you break it down. Pei is 80, Yud is 10, Lamed is 30, Gimel is 3, and Shin is 300. Together that gives you 423. You add those numbers up. The base number is, or the base gematria number, is 9, which represents birth or judgment. And the ninth letter in the Ibri is, in the alphabet, is Tet, which means like to enwrap, to surround. It could even implement like trapping, surrounding, containing. Okay, I think the ancient version of it, not in the block form, was like a basket with a snake in it or something like that. Okay, now when I broke this word down, okay, pay is like mouth, open, enter. Yud is like hand, produce or make. Staff, the lamed is like the staff, which is like to teach, and it can also refer to a body part. The gimel is the camel, which is like to walk or carry or gather. And the shin is like teeth, to press, to eat, or it can mean like to repeatedly do something, because when you eat, you go, okay? And that's my cat. And together, you could get something like this. The mouth or opening causes or makes the staff to go down repeatedly. Okay? So we know when we're referring to a woman, we know what type of opening we're referring to. The staff, obviously, you could probably get the correct inference there. Regarding to a male body part, go down repeatedly. So this has nothing to do with, like, obviously, it has to do with a sexual act, but it's not the same as the word for wife. Okay, the word for wife is a little bit different, and there's one word in Ecclesiastes that is used. I think it's used for concubine, but actually it's like referring to a wife. It has somewhat of a similar connotation as this, but it's more so like there's an actual committed element, of covenant there. Now, this word, pilegesh, is appears about 37 times in the Tanakh, or Old Testament, people would say. And we're going to look at some of those verses. I'm not going to look at all the verses in this particular video. I'm going to look at some, and then we'll continue. Oops. I don't know what that is. Oh, papers. Okay, I have a kitty that keeps coming by here. Okay. I'm just trying to make sure I got the right papers. Cain. Okay. So, anyway, we have Genesis. We're going to look at some verses in Genesis. We're going to look at some verses in Judges and 2 Samuel. You also will see some in 1 Kings, 1 Chronicles, 2 Chronicles, Book of Esther, Song of Solomon, Ezekiel, and Daniel. Okay? But we're going to look at primarily focusing on the verses in Genesis first. Okay? So here are some of the verses where we see, the first time we see the mention of concubine, Pelegesh, we see it in Genesis chapter 22, verse 24. And it reads, "And his concubine, whose name was Ruma, she bare also Tebah, and Gahem, and Thahash, and Ma'akah." Okay? Now, I noted here that this is referring to Bethuel. This is one of Abraham's relatives. And this is where we get Rebecca from. Okay? So, Bethuel, who begat Ribka, or Rebecca, had a concubine. And that's his concubine's name, Rumah. So the concubine here we see can bear the children of a man. Okay, what people would refer to as, a baby's daddy. Okay, not necessarily a father, but baby's daddy. That type of connotation. So these are just some characteristics of what we see that happens to a concubine. Okay, so one thing we see here is that a concubine can bear children of a man. All right, let's look at Genesis chapter 25, verse 6. "But unto the sons of the concubines," okay, unto the sons of the concubines which Abraham had, Abraham gave gifts and sent them away from Isaac his son, while he yet lived, eastward unto the east country. So here we see that Abraham does give gifts to the sons of his concubines, okay? But if you notice the difference here, I wrote, a man gives gifts, a man can give gifts to the children of a concubine, but he is not obliged to give an inheritance. I will repeat it again. All right? A man can give gifts to the children of a concubine, but he is not obliged or obligated to give an inheritance. So we see here that, yes, a concubine can definitely bear children for a man, and the sons or children of a concubine can receive gifts from the man who is their father, all right, in this case. And Abraham actually had 2 concubines, okay? So if you're like, Abraham had concubines, we know Hagar's one, and Keturah was the other one, okay? They were both concubines. His only wife was Sarah, okay, but he had 2 concubines, Hagar and Keturah. He had Keturah as his concubine after Sarah, his wife, passed away, all right? From what I remember reading, actually. Let's look at Genesis chapter 35, verse 22. "And it came to pass, when Israel dwelt in that land, that Reuben went and laid with Bilhah, his father's concubine. And Israel heard. Now the sons of Jacob were 12. So Reuben was the firstborn of Jacob, Israel's sons. And obviously we know that Israel, Yaakov, he had two wives, which is Leah and Rachel, and he also had two concubines, which was Zilpah and Bilhah, okay? And obviously, as we would see, he would give gifts to, his sons, but not necessarily obligated to give an inheritance, all right? In this case as well. Let's also look at Judges chapter 19, verse 1. And it came to pass in those days, when there was no king in Israel, that there was a certain Levim, or Levite, sojourning on the side of Mount Ephraim, who took to him a concubine out of Bethlehem, Yehudah. Okay? And you could also look at the verses of Judges, the same chapter, verse 2, 9, 10, 24, 25, 27, and 29. These 8 verses mention about the concubine. And what's very critical and key here to realize is this. If you read this chapter, Judges chapter 19, this Lewi man most likely was engaged to this woman, but because he was intimate with her, she was technically his concubine. Okay, so I'm going to read it again. This Lewi man was most likely engaged to this woman, but was intimate with her prior to entering into covenant with her, due to her father considering him as a son-in-law. They were living together and or being intimate with each other prior to a genuine marital covenant. Okay, so he probably, like I said, he was probably engaged with her, but being intimate with her. So yes, so a woman can become a concubine, even though they might be engaged to a man. She becomes a concubine if she goes live with him and lays with him. Okay, then this woman technically becomes a concubine, because a genuine, solid marital covenant has not been made. Now, if you look at this chapter, Judges chapter 19, you see that the father, did consider him as a son-in-law, but he, continuously says that she was a concubine. And I don't know if there was any type of solid covenant made between them. So this really suggests that they were probably engaged. But she had went a whoring, and he went to get her back, and she left for a few months, but she went back to her father's house. So that means she was living with him before actually sealing the deal of the marital covenant. She was living with him. She did something, she was unfaithful to him. She went to her father's house and was there for several months before he came to go get her down in Bethlehem, Yehudah. Okay? That's how it pretty much the setting of this chapter starts. So one thing is very notable about this Lewi man. When he comes to get his concubine, okay, this man is not willing to lay down his life for his concubine. He feels no obligation to lay down his life for his concubine. So what happens is, in this particular chapter, he stays with his concubine's father's house for, I don't know how long, but he's ready to go back to his home and on Mount Ephraim. And they sojourn through the land of Benjamin. And an old man takes him and his concubine and his servant in. And all of a sudden, these men in the town want to, lay hold of the man. And so this Lewi man literally gives his concubine to these men to essentially rape her to death. Okay? And so he could save his own life. See, he wasn't really concerned about hers, so he could save his own life. And it really shows you here, how much he did not really value her. He did not, like I said, there was no solid marital covenant. They were most likely, in this case, engaged. But, he didn't fight for her. And she died in the end in this chapter 19. And then it's mentioned again in chapter 20, verses 4, 5, and 6. Okay, let's look at some other ones. Okay, because I'm not going to go and do a lot of detailed reading, but I'm going to look at some highlight on some key verses and give you summaries of these things. Okay, so 2 Samuel chapter 3, verse 7. And Shaul had a concubine whose name was Rizpah, the daughter of Aiah, and Ishbosheth said to Abner, "Wherefore have you gone into my father's concubine?" So here we see that a man's former concubine can become another man's concubine. Okay, so we know that by this time King Shaul had passed away. And, Abner wanted to show his power over Ishbosheth. And so he laid with Shaul's concubine. And that's why Shaul's son, Ishbosheth, even though he was announced as king, this is at the time when David was anointed as king over just the children of Yehuda before all of Israel joined themselves to David. And this is a way that men would do this, you see, in 2 Samuel, where they would take another man's concubine and lay with her to show power over the other man. You don't really see this happening with wives. They only did it with like concubines. And so obviously the value of a concubine was not as protected as a woman who was a wife. Okay? Okay, let's look at some other ones. We also have 2 Samuel chapter 5, verse 13. This one's a very sad one. Okay? And David took more concubines and wives out of Jerusalem after he had come from Hebron, and there were yet sons and daughters born to David. Okay? So it's mentioned, two words are mentioned here when it says concubines and wives. One says Piglagshim, meaning concubines plural, Piglagshim, and Nashim, which is wives, plural. It can also be translated as women as well, so you can also do it that way. But as you can see here, if you are with a man but have no ketubah or covenant, then you are a concubine. All right? We're going to look at also 2 Samuel chapter 15, verse 16. And the king went forth, and all his household after him. And the king left 10 women, concubines, to keep the house. Now, a concubine is similar to a wife because the concubines in this case are keeping the house. But they're not as valued, nor are they as loved as a wife. David took his wives with him, but left the concubines behind. Okay, he left 10 concubines. Now, he might have taken some concubines with him. Who knows? We don't really know how many concubines he had, but we know it does mentions nothing about wives being left behind. Only the concubines. So he took his wives with him when he was running for his life from Absalom. He took his wives with him. Okay, so we see here that a concubine functions similar to a wife, but they don't have the same rights or privileges as a wife who's in covenant with a man. All right. So 2 Samuel chapter 16, verse 21. And Ahithophel said unto Absalom, "Go into your father's concubines, which he has left to keep the house. And all Israel shall hear that you are abhorred of your father. Then shall the hands of all that are with you be strong." So here we see that this is like a power struggle going on. Ahithophel telling Absalom, Absalom is King David's son. It's one of King David's son. And telling him to go and lay with his father's concubines to try to show power over his father. Okay, this is essentially what this was an act of. Without any consideration of the concubines, obviously. In 2 Samuel chapter 16, the next verse, 22 says, "So they spread Absalom a tent on the top of the house," okay, so on the rooftop, "and Absalom went in unto his concubines in the sight of all Israel." Okay, they literally put a tent on top of the rooftop, the house, the roof, and just a public display of power. It wasn't done for, because he loved these women. Mm-mm. It was display his authority over his father. Okay, so 2 Samuel chapter 20 verse 3 reads. 2 Samuel chapter 20 verse 3 reads, "And David came to his house at Jerusalem, and the king took the 10 women, his concubines, whom he had left to keep the house, and put them in ward, and fed them, but went not in unto them. So they were shut up unto the day of their death, living in widowhood." Now, literally here, after they had been, defiled by King David's son, he's essentially he supported them, made sure they were, probably had food and clothing. But beyond that, he had nothing else to do with them. And so they were literally, the Hebrew word, when it says living in widowhood, it literally means living widows. They became like living widows. So even though King David was still alive and they were still being supported, he had no intimacy with these 10 women. And so they were essentially living widows. They were living without affection. And actually, the word shut up, when it says, so they were shut up until the day of their death, it literally means they suffered the affliction. They suffered distress, that they did not have the comfort of being, caressed and loved anymore. So they were essentially living widows. All right? That's essentially what it means, okay? So the word here, I'm looking at it. Okay. Ame nuth. Kai oth. Ka uth. Alme nuth. Ka youth. Okay? Now we know that even in King Solomon's situation, 1 Kings chapter 11 verse 3 reads, "And he had 700 wives and 300 concubines. And his wives turned away his heart." Okay? I'm sorry. That's my phone. Okay. All right. So, let's see. We're almost done with this part, and then we're gonna focus more on what we see, the process of what wives, how does a woman become a wife. Right now we're just seeing what's happening with concubines. Okay, so the last verse here that I'm going to focus on before we switch over to part 3 is 1 Chronicles chapter 1 verse 32. "Now the sons of Keturah, Abraham's concubine, she bare Zimran and Yokshan and Medan and Midian and Ishbak and Shua, and the sons of Yokshan, Sheba and Dedan." Okay? So here we see, as I mentioned again, that Abraham had only one wife, which is Sarah, and 2 concubines, Hagar and Keturah. So he actually had total 8 sons. It was Ishmael, okay, Isaac, and the 6 sons of Keturah. But he only gave gifts to the children of the concubine. He did not give inheritance to those sons, just gifts. All right? So this is how we see concubines being treated in the Tanakh. Okay? They can bear children. Their children can be given gifts, but they don't get the same protection of inheritance and security as a wife does in the scriptures. Also, you'll come to realize that in Esther chapter 2 verse 14, that Queen Esther, she was actually a concubine queen. Okay, a concubine queen. She was selected amongst a group of concubines, and she was selected to be the queen out of those concubines. And we'll look at that in a little bit later. But for right now, I just want you to just go through those verses that I mentioned, and we'll focus more on how how does one be a wife versus being a concubine? Because the one thing that you will see, that modern day concubine, the modern day girlfriend boyfriend, is the modern day concubine. And I will be reading you that excerpt in the next video. Okay? Now with that, I say shalom. Shalom.